The chocolate cake sat untouched on the kitchen counter, its rainbow sprinkles catching the afternoon light like tiny promises of joy that would never be fulfilled. Valentina Martinez stood in her daughter's empty bedroom, still wearing her dress uniform, still feeling the sting of whispered words that had cut deeper than any battlefield wound she'd ever endured. 3 hours ago, she had been escorted out of her own daughter's birthday party by concerned parents who decided she wasn't the kind of influence their children needed. And now, as the evening news played softly in the background, those same parents would learn that the woman they'd dismissed as unstable was the decorated colonel who'd been quietly keeping their community safe for the past decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Valentina had never planned on wearing her uniform to 8-year-old Sofia's birthday party. She'd laid out a simple sundress that morning, yellow with tiny white flowers, the kind of outfit that screamed suburban mom rather than military officer. But sometimes life doesn't follow the schedule you've carefully mapped out, especially when you receive an emergency call at 6 in the morning about a security briefing that couldn't wait. By the time she'd finished coordinating logistics for a humanitarian mission deployment, Sofia was already in tears because the other parents would start arriving in 20 minutes and mommy still wasn't ready. The uniform was crisp, adorned with ribbons that told stories Sofia didn't yet understand. There was the Bronze Star from her third deployment, the Meritorious Service Medal from her work establishing medical outposts in remote regions, and the Combat Action Badge that represented nights she'd rather forget. But to Sofia, it was just mommy's work clothes, no different than Dr. Peterson's white coat or Mrs. Chen's business suit. Valentina had grabbed her keys, promising herself she'd change after dropping Sofia off, but then she'd seen her daughter's face light up with pride as she pointed to the ribbons and asked if she could wear one too. The Riverside Community Center had been transformed into a princess wonderland, complete with pink streamers and a bounce house that dominated the main hall. Valentina walked in, holding Sofia's hand, immediately noticing how the conversation volume dropped several decibels. She recognized most of the faces from school pickup lines and PTA meetings, parents she'd exchanged polite smiles with but never quite connected to. They lived in a world of organic snacks and soccer practice schedules, while she navigated intelligence reports and mission parameters. Jessica Patterson was the first to approach, her perfectly blown-out hair catching the artificial lighting as she glided over with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her place in any room. She managed the local boutique fitness studio and drove a white Range Rover that always seemed to sparkle, even in winter. Her smile was wide but didn't reach her eyes as she gestured toward Valentina's uniform with a manicured finger. "Oh, honey," Jessica said, with the kind of tone reserved for explaining things to small children, "this is just a casual kids' party. You know you could have worn regular clothes, right?" She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, seemingly innocent but somehow sharp around the edges. Several other parents had started to drift closer, drawn by the subtle spectacle unfolding near the gift table. Valentina felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice steady. "I came straight from work. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss Sofia's special day." She'd learned long ago that explaining herself too much often made situations worse, but something about Jessica's expression suggested this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. Marcus Chen, whose wife ran the school's fundraising committee, stepped forward with his arms crossed. He worked in marketing for a tech startup and had the kind of confident posture that came from never having his authority questioned in professional settings. "Look, I get that everyone has different jobs," he said, his voice carrying across the room more than necessary, "but maybe next time consider what message you're sending to the kids. This is supposed to be a celebration, not a military demonstration." The words hit Valentina like ice water. She glanced around the room, suddenly hyper-aware of how every conversation had stopped. Parents who'd been laughing moments before now stood frozen, their eyes darting between her and their own children as if calculating potential threats. Sofia had run off to join her friends at the craft table, blissfully unaware that her mother was being quietly evaluated by a jury of her peers. Rebecca Thornton, whose husband was a corporate lawyer and whose Instagram account documented their family's organic lifestyle, moved closer with the kind of deliberate steps people use when approaching unpredictable animals. "I think what Marcus is trying to say," she began, her voice syrupy with false concern, "is that some of the children might find the uniform intimidating. We've worked really hard to create a peaceful, nurturing environment for them." Valentina had faced down insurgents in hostile territories, navigated complex diplomatic negotiations in war zones, and maintained her composure during combat situations that would have broken lesser soldiers. But standing in that community center, surrounded by birthday decorations and the judgment of people who'd never looked beyond their own neighborhood boundaries, she felt smaller than she had in years. These weren't enemies firing weapons across a battlefield. These were the parents of her daughter's classmates, people she'd hoped would become part of their community, their extended family. "I understand your concerns," Valentina replied, her military training keeping her voice level even as her heart rate climbed. "But this uniform represents service and sacrifice, values I'm proud to demonstrate to any child." She could hear the formal tone creeping into her speech, the same cadence she used during briefings, and she knew it was making things worse. These parents didn't want to hear about service or sacrifice. They wanted her to apologize for being different, for reminding them that their comfortable suburban bubble existed because people like her stood guard at its borders. The situation escalated when Tommy Patterson, Jessica's 7-year-old son, tugged on his mother's designer jeans and asked loudly why Sofia's mom was dressed like a soldier. Jessica's response was swift and cutting. "Sometimes adults make choices that aren't appropriate for children's parties, sweetheart. That's why it's important to think about others before we act." The implication hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Valentina felt her hands clench into fists at her sides, a response she quickly forced herself to relax. She'd spent 15 years in the military, rising through ranks in a field dominated by men who'd questioned her ability at every turn. She'd proven herself in combat zones where hesitation meant death, earned the respect of soldiers who initially saw her as nothing more than a diversity hire. But none of that seemed to matter here, in a room full of bounce houses and birthday cake where her uniform made her the outsider. Dr. Amanda Foster, a pediatrician whose calm demeanor usually made her the voice of reason among the parent group, approached with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Valentina, I'm sure you understand that children can sometimes misinterpret symbols of authority and conflict.
Perhaps it would be best if you went home to change. Sofia can stay, of course. We'll make sure she has a wonderful time." The dismissal was polite but absolute. Valentina looked across the room to where Sofia was giggling with her friends, her face painted with butterfly wings that sparkled under the party lights. Her daughter was having the childhood Valentina had never experienced, surrounded by friends who saw her as just another kid, rather than the daughter of a woman who'd chosen duty over conventional motherhood. The last thing Valentina wanted was to become the reason Sofia felt different, the way she'd felt different her entire life. "I think that's probably for the best," Marcus added, his tone suggesting the decision had already been made by committee. "No hard feelings, of course. We all want what's best for the children." Valentina nodded slowly, understanding that she was being given a face-saving exit rather than a choice. She walked over to Sofia, knelt down to her daughter's level, and whispered that Mommy had to leave but would pick her up later. Sofia's face fell for just a moment before one of her friends pulled her toward the bounce house, and the disappointment was forgotten in the way only children can manage. As Valentina walked toward the exit, she heard the conversations resume behind her, voices carefully modulated to sound casual rather than victorious. She pushed through the double doors into the parking lot, where the late afternoon sun felt harsh against her face. Her car sat alone in the far corner, a modest sedan that looked out of place among the luxury SUVs and sports cars that surrounded it. She sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel as she processed what had just happened. These people knew nothing about her except what they could see in a 30-second interaction. They didn't know about the nights she'd spent awake, planning missions that would bring soldiers home safely. They didn't know about the school she'd helped build in villages where children had never seen a book. They didn't know that the ribbons on her chest represented not just her own courage, but her commitment to protecting people exactly like them. But as Valentina drove home through the tree-lined streets of her neighborhood, past houses where American flags hung from front porches, she realized something that cut deeper than their rejection. They didn't want to know. They were comfortable with their assumptions, satisfied with their surface-level judgments. In their world, she would always be the woman who wore the wrong thing to a children's party, rather than the person who dedicated her life to ensuring their children could have parties at all. What they didn't know was that Colonel Valentina Martinez had been quietly shaping their world for years, making decisions that affected their safety, their community, and their children's futures. And in exactly 4 hours, they would learn that the woman they'd dismissed so easily was about to be honored at their own children's school for her contributions to military families and educational initiatives. The reckoning was coming, but Valentina hadn't orchestrated it. Sometimes the truth simply had a schedule of its own. Valentina Maria Martinez had learned early that being underestimated was both a burden and a gift. Growing up in East Los Angeles, she was the daughter of Miguel Martinez, a mechanic who worked double shifts to keep their small apartment, and Rosa Martinez, who cleaned office buildings at night so she could be home when Valentina finished school. Their neighborhood wasn't the kind that produced military officers. It produced workers, survivors, people who understood that dreams were luxuries reserved for families with different zip codes. At Roosevelt High School, Valentina was the girl who asked too many questions in history class, who spent lunch periods in the library reading about military strategy instead of gossiping about weekend plans. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Henderson, meant well when she suggested Valentina consider community college and perhaps a career in healthcare or education, something stable, she'd said, something realistic for a girl from her background. Mrs. Henderson had never seen Valentina organize the school's earthquake preparedness drill with the precision of a seasoned commander, or watched her mediate conflicts between rival groups with diplomatic skills that would have impressed seasoned negotiators. The military recruiter who visited Roosevelt High that spring was Sergeant First Class Patricia Williams, a black woman whose presence commanded respect the moment she walked into the school cafeteria. While other students saw her as just another adult trying to sell them something, Valentina saw possibility. She stayed after the presentation, asking questions about leadership opportunities, about pathways to become an officer, about whether someone like her could really succeed in a world that seemed designed for people from different backgrounds. Sergeant Williams studied Valentina with eyes that had seen potential overlooked by others. She didn't make promises about easy paths or guaranteed success. Instead, she spoke about earning respect, one mission at a time, about proving yourself through competence rather than connections. She handed Valentina her card and said something that would echo in her mind for years to come. The military doesn't care where you came from. It only cares where you're willing to go. Valentina's parents received the news of her ROT scholarship to UC Davis with a mixture of pride and terror. They'd sacrificed everything to give their daughter opportunities they'd never had, but sending her into the military felt like handing her over to an institution that might not value her the way they did. Her father worried about discrimination, about glass ceilings that might prevent her from advancing. Her mother worried about danger, about deployments to places that existed only in news reports about conflicts she didn't fully understand. But Valentina had already made her choice. At 18, she understood something her parents' generation couldn't quite grasp. The military might be her best chance to prove that excellence had no zip code, no accent, no predetermined limitations. She would either succeed spectacularly or fail completely, but she would never wonder what might have been possible if she'd been brave enough to try. Her first year at UC Davis was a masterclass in being invisible. While her dorm mates bonded over shared experiences at prep schools and summer camps and places like Martha's Vineyard, Valentina found herself translating not just language, but entire cultural references. She learned to code switch between the Spanish she spoke with her family and the military bearings she adopted during ROT's training. She discovered that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being the most prepared, the most reliable, the one others turned to when situations became complicated. Captain Robert Mackenzie was her first real mentor, a career officer who'd risen through the ranks during some of the military's most challenging decades. He recognized something in Valentina that reminded him of his younger self, the hunger to prove that merit mattered more than pedigree. Under his guidance, she learned that military leadership was about more than giving orders. It was about understanding people, about inspiring them to exceed their own expectations, about making decisions under pressure that would affect lives beyond her own. Captain Robert Mackenzie was her first real mentor, a career officer who'd risen through the ranks during some of the military's most challenging decades. He recognized something in Valentina that reminded him of his younger self, the hunger to prove that merit mattered more than pedigree. Under his guidance, she learned that military leadership was about more than giving orders. It was about understanding people, about inspiring them to exceed their own expectations, about making decisions under pressure that would affect lives beyond her own.
Her fellow cadets initially saw her as the diversity candidate, the scholarship student who'd gotten opportunities through programs designed to level playing fields rather than through inherent ability. They weren't overtly hostile, just dismissive in the way people are when they assume they know your entire story based on surface observations. They saw her use textbooks and her careful budgeting, her weekend job at a local restaurant instead of fraternity parties, and they made assumptions about her capabilities based on her circumstances. Valentina let them think whatever they wanted. While they debated strategy in theoretical terms, she was studying real conflicts, learning from officers who'd commanded troops in actual combat zones. While they complained about the physical demands of training, she was exceeding every benchmark, pushing herself beyond requirements because she understood that being good enough would never be enough. She had to be exceptional, not because she was naturally gifted, but because exceptional was the minimum standard for someone who looked like her in a world that expected her to fail. Her breakthrough moment came during a complex field exercise in her junior year. The scenario involved a humanitarian crisis with multiple moving parts: displaced civilians, limited resources, competing priorities, and communication breakdowns that tested every leadership principle they'd studied. While her team leaders argued about protocol and hierarchy, Valentina quietly began coordinating logistics. She organized medical triage, established supply chains, and created communication networks that kept information flowing between different units. When the exercise concluded, the evaluating officers specifically noted her performance, not because she'd been the loudest or most aggressive, but because she'd been effective. She demonstrated the kind of quiet competence that formed the backbone of successful military operations. Her classmates couldn't dismiss her anymore because the results spoke for themselves. She wasn't the diversity candidate who'd gotten lucky. She was the future officer they all hoped to become. After graduation and commissioning as a second lieutenant, Valentina's first assignment was to Fort Stewart, Georgia, where she quickly learned that proving herself in training was different from proving herself in reality. The soldiers under her command were older, more experienced, and skeptical of any new officer, especially one who looked like someone's younger sister rather than a military leader. They tested her with subtle insubordination, with questions designed to expose knowledge gaps, with situations that required her to choose between being liked and being respected. Valentina chose respect every time. She studied her soldiers' files with the dedication of a scholar, learning their backgrounds, their strengths, their personal challenges. She led from the front during physical training, never asking them to do anything she couldn't do herself. When Specialist Rodriguez was struggling with a family crisis back home, she helped him navigate military support services. When Sergeant Thompson questioned her tactical decision during a training exercise, she explained her reasoning in detail, then asked for his input on alternative approaches. Slowly, her unit began to function as more than just a collection of individuals following orders. They became a team that anticipated each other's needs, that executed complex maneuvers with precision, that took pride in their collective achievements. During inspections, their equipment was immaculate. During exercises, their performance was exemplary. Word began to spread through the battalion that Lieutenant Martinez's platoon was setting standards others aspired to meet. Her first deployment came 2 years later to Afghanistan, where theoretical leadership principles collided with the reality of a complex, dangerous, and often heartbreaking mission. Valentina found herself responsible not just for military objectives, but for winning hearts and minds in communities where trust had been shattered by decades of conflict. She coordinated with local leaders, oversaw reconstruction projects, and managed the delicate balance between security operations and humanitarian assistance. The breakthrough came when she proposed establishing a medical clinic in a village that had been without health care for months. The idea required navigating military bureaucracy, coordinating with international aid organizations, and convincing local tribal leaders that the project served their community's interests rather than just military objectives. It took weeks of careful negotiation, cultural sensitivity training for her soldiers, and creative problem-solving around logistical challenges. When the clinic opened, it served over 300 people in its first month. Children received vaccinations they'd never had access to, women received prenatal care that dramatically reduced infant mortality rates, elderly residents received treatment for chronic conditions that had gone unaddressed for years. The clinic became a symbol of what was possible when military efficiency combined with genuine care for civilian welfare. The success didn't go unnoticed. Valentina received her first commendation for innovative community engagement, followed by rapid promotion to captain. But more importantly, she'd discovered her calling, using military resources and leadership principles to solve complex humanitarian problems. She wasn't just a soldier following orders. She was a bridge builder, connecting military capabilities with civilian needs in ways that created lasting positive change. Her second deployment took her to Iraq, where she commanded a larger unit responsible for coordinating with international partners on refugee assistance programs. The work was more complex, involving multiple government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and cultural considerations that required diplomatic skills she'd never formally studied. Valentina found herself mediating between competing interests, translating military objectives into humanitarian outcomes, and building consensus among groups that had little reason to trust each other. The refugee camp outside Erbil housed over 15,000 people who'd fled violence in their home regions. Living conditions were harsh, resources were limited, and tensions between different ethnic and religious groups created daily challenges that threatened to explode into larger conflicts. Valentina's job was to ensure security while supporting humanitarian agencies providing assistance to camp residents. What she discovered was that security and humanitarian assistance weren't separate objectives. They were interconnected challenges that required integrated solutions. She worked with camp administrators to establish fair resource distribution systems. She coordinated with medical teams to address health crises before they became epidemics. She organized educational programs for children who'd been out of school for months or years. Most importantly, she listened. She spent hours in conversation with camp elders, understanding their concerns, their hopes, their fears for their families' futures. She learned enough Arabic to communicate basic concepts without translators. She studied the cultural traditions that shaped community dynamics, recognizing that effective leadership required cultural competence as much as military expertise. Under her coordination, the camp transformed from a barely controlled crisis into a functioning community.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Crime rates dropped as residents gained confidence in fair treatment. Medical outcomes improved as preventative care programs addressed problems before they became emergencies. Educational programs gave children hope for futures beyond the camp boundaries. When Valentina rotated back to the United States after her second deployment, she carried with her not just military decorations, but a profound understanding of leadership that extended far beyond battlefield tactics. She'd learned that true strength often looked like service, that effective command sometimes meant stepping back to let others lead, and that the most important victories were often invisible to those who hadn't shared the struggle. She also carried something else. The knowledge that the skills she'd developed, the perspective she'd gained, and the networks she'd built could be used to address challenges in her own community. The same strategic thinking that had helped establish medical clinics in Afghanistan could be applied to addressing healthcare access in underserved American communities. The same diplomatic skills that had mediated conflicts between tribal leaders could help bridge divides between different groups in her hometown. But first, she had a daughter to raise, a community to join, and a life to build that honored both her service and her dreams for the future. What she didn't anticipate was how difficult it would be to explain her experiences to people who'd never lived outside their comfortable assumptions about who belonged where and what military service really meant in a world that often preferred simple narratives to complex truths.
The call came at 5:37 in the morning, exactly 18 hours after Valentina had left Sofia's birthday party with the taste of humiliation still sharp in her mouth. Principal Dorothy Washington's voice was crisp and apologetic, explaining that the evening's planned ceremony at Riverside Elementary would need to proceed as scheduled despite the complicated circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on either woman. Valentina was being honored at the same school where her daughter's classmates' parents had decided she wasn't appropriate company for children. Principal Washington had been coordinating with the Department of Defense for 3 months to arrange this recognition ceremony. Colonel Martinez was receiving the Distinguished Service Award for her development of innovative educational programs that supported military families transitioning to civilian communities. Her work had directly impacted over 2,000 children across 12 states, creating support networks that helped them maintain academic progress despite the unique challenges of military life. What made the situation particularly complex was that several of the parents who'd asked her to leave the birthday party served on the school's PTA board. They'd been instrumental in organizing this very ceremony, sending invitations, arranging media coverage, and coordinating the reception afterward. None of them had connected the dots between the woman they'd dismissed and the decorated officer they were preparing to celebrate. Valentina dressed carefully that evening, choosing her dress blues with the same precision she'd once used to plan complex military operations. Each ribbon told a story: the Bronze Star with Valor device from her 3rd deployment, where she'd coordinated the evacuation of a besieged medical facility while under direct fire; the Defense Meritorious Service Medal from her work establishing trauma counseling protocols for children in conflict zones; the Afghanistan Campaign Medal with 4 Bronze Service Stars representing multiple deployments where she'd served as liaison between military forces and humanitarian organizations. But the decoration that meant the most to her was the one that wouldn't be visible to tonight's audience: a hand-drawn medal Sofia had made for her last Mother's Day, constructed from cardboard and aluminum foil with the words "World's Best Mom" written in purple crayon. That medal was pinned to the inside of her jacket pocket, close to her heart, a reminder that her most important mission had always been raising a daughter who understood that strength came in many forms. The elementary school gymnasium had been transformed for the occasion. Red, white, and blue bunting adorned the walls, and rows of folding chairs faced a small stage where Principal Washington would present the award. Local media representatives checked their equipment, preparing to document what they understood to be a significant community event. Military families filled the front section, parents and children who understood the sacrifice and dedication being honored tonight. Valentina arrived through the side entrance at exactly 6:45, 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. She moved with the quiet confidence that came from years of entering spaces where her presence might not be welcomed but her competence couldn't be questioned. Principal Washington met her backstage, a tall woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes who'd spent 30 years in education, most of it advocating for students others had written off. "I need to warn you," Principal Washington said quietly, "several of the parents who'll be in attendance tonight were involved in the incident at your daughter's birthday party. They don't yet know who you are. How would you like to handle the situation?" Valentina considered this carefully. She could have requested that those specific parents be asked to leave, could have demanded that they face consequences for their behavior, could have used this moment to shame them as publicly as they'd shamed her. Instead, she thought about Sofia, about the lesson her daughter would learn from whatever happened next. "Let them discover the truth naturally," Valentina replied. "Sometimes education happens when people realize their assumptions were wrong. Tonight might be one of those times for some folks." The ceremony began with Principal Washington addressing the assembled crowd, explaining the significance of the award and the impact of Colonel Martinez's work on military families. She spoke about innovative programs that had reduced academic failure rates among military children by 47%, about counseling protocols that had helped thousands of families navigate the challenges of multiple deployments, about research that had informed policy decisions affecting military families nationwide. Jessica Patterson sat in the 3rd row, checking her phone periodically while maintaining the appearance of engaged attention. She'd come because her position on the PTA board required her presence at school events, and because the local news station would be filming. Her Instagram followers expected regular updates about her community involvement, and being seen at military appreciation events reinforced her image as a patriotic community leader.
Marcus Chen sat 2 rows behind her, having arrived directly from his office where he'd been preparing a presentation about corporate social responsibility. He appreciated the military's role in national security, but found these ceremonial events somewhat tedious. His attendance was more about maintaining professional relationships than genuine interest in military affairs. His wife insisted they come because several of their daughter's teachers would be watching to see which parents supported school events. Dr. Amanda Foster had positioned herself near the back of the gymnasium, close enough to demonstrate support, but ready to leave if her pager indicated a medical emergency. She respected military service in abstract terms, but found the formal ceremonies somewhat intimidating. Her understanding of military culture was limited to what she'd seen in movies and read in medical journals about treating veterans with PTSD. When Principal Washington announced Colonel Valentina Martinez, the gymnasium erupted in respectful applause. Military families stood first, followed by teachers and school staff who understood the significance of the recognition. Parents throughout the audience joined in politely, still unaware that they were applauding someone most of them had never seen before. Valentina walked across the stage with bearing that spoke of confidence earned through adversity overcome. She wore her uniform with the pride of someone who'd honored its traditions while fighting to expand its possibilities. Her movements were precise but not rigid, commanding respect without demanding attention. This was who she'd always been, even when others could only see what they expected to find. The moment of recognition rippled through the audience like a wave.
It started with Jessica Patterson, whose perfectly maintained composure cracked as she realized she was looking at the woman she'd dismissed 24 hours earlier. Her hand flew to her mouth, an involuntary gesture that drew attention from nearby parents who followed her shocked gaze toward the stage. Marcus Chen's reaction was more subdued but equally stunned. He leaned forward in his chair, squinting as if better focus might change what he was seeing. The woman on stage accepting military honors was indisputably the same person he'd suggested was sending inappropriate messages to children. His marketing mind immediately began calculating reputational damage, while his conscience grappled with the magnitude of his misjudgment. Dr. Foster felt her medical training kick in as her heart rate elevated and her palms grew damp. She'd spent years studying human behavior, but she'd never experienced such a complete reversal of her own perceptions. The woman she'd recommended should leave her daughter's party for the children's well-being was being honored for her contributions to children's welfare on a national scale. The citation Principal Washington read aloud detailed achievements that painted a picture of extraordinary service. Colonel Martinez had developed educational transition programs now used by military bases worldwide. She'd authored research on childhood resilience that influenced policy at the Pentagon. She'd personally mentored over 100 military children whose parents had been killed or wounded in service, helping them maintain academic progress while processing traumatic loss. But it was the final paragraph that hit the assembled parents like a physical blow. Colonel Martinez's most recent assignment included developing community integration protocols that help military families build connections with civilian neighbors. Her research identified social isolation as a primary factor in academic and emotional difficulties experienced by military children, particularly when families attempt to integrate into communities unfamiliar with military culture. The irony was devastating in its completeness. The woman they'd isolated was an expert in the dangers of isolation. The person they'd excluded from their community had dedicated her career to helping military families find acceptance in civilian communities. Their treatment of her had been a textbook example of exactly the kind of prejudice her work was designed to address. Rebecca Thornton, who'd expressed concern about Valentina's uniform intimidating children, felt physically nauseous as she realized she'd been lecturing an expert in child psychology about child welfare. Her organic lifestyle blog suddenly seemed insignificant compared to Colonel Martinez's work establishing medical clinics for refugee children. Her concerns about peaceful environments rang hollow when directed at someone who'd actually created peace in war zones. When the formal presentation concluded and the audience began to disperse toward the reception area, the reckoning began. Jessica Patterson approached first, her usual confidence replaced by visible discomfort. She'd built her social identity around being the kind of person who always said the right thing, who always understood social situations correctly. Standing before Colonel Martinez, she struggled to find words that wouldn't make her previous behavior seem even worse. Colonel Martinez, Jessica began, then stopped. Using the military title felt awkward after yesterday's dismissal, but using her first name seemed inappropriately familiar. I owe you an apology. We had no idea who you were or what you'd accomplished. Yesterday at Sofia's party, we made assumptions that were completely wrong. Valentina studied Jessica's face, seeing genuine regret mixed with social embarrassment. The assumptions you made weren't about who I was, she replied calmly. They were about who you thought I should be. My rank doesn't change the fact that you believed someone in military uniform was inappropriate around children. That says more about your perceptions than about my qualifications. Marcus Chen joined the conversation, bringing with him the kind of corporate crisis management approach he used when client relationships needed repair. Colonel Martinez, speaking for several of us, we realize we handled yesterday's situation poorly. We'd like to find a way to make this right, perhaps invite you to speak at future school events or PTA meetings. The way to make this right, Valentina responded, isn't to give me a platform to speak. It's to examine why you assumed I needed to be managed rather than welcomed. It's to consider how your children learn to see people in uniform as problems to be solved rather than neighbors to be respected. Dr. Foster approached last, her medical background making her acutely aware of the stress responses she was observing in both herself and the other parents. Colonel Martinez, as someone who works with children professionally, I'm particularly troubled by my own reaction yesterday. I let assumptions override my training. I'm wondering if you might be willing to help us understand how to avoid these mistakes in the future. For the first time that evening, Valentina's expression softened slightly. Dr. Foster, the fact that you're asking that question suggests you're already moving in the right direction. Military families don't expect special treatment. We just want the same thing every family wants, for our children to be judged by their character rather than by perceptions about their parents' careers. The conversation was interrupted by Sofia, who'd been waiting patiently through the adult discussions. She ran to her mother with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of childhood, wrapping her arms around Valentina's waist and looking up with pure pride. "Mommy, everyone says you're a hero. I already knew that, but now they know it too." Valentina knelt to Sofia's level, straightening one of the butterfly clips in her daughter's hair. "Baby, being a hero isn't about what other people think. It's about doing the right thing even when it's hard, even when people don't understand why you're doing it." Sofia nodded seriously, then brightened.
Like when you wear your uniform to my birthday party, even though some grown-ups don't understand that it's beautiful? The question carried more wisdom than any military decoration. In that moment, surrounded by parents who were grappling with their own prejudices and preconceptions, Valentina understood that her daughter had learned the most important lesson of all, that worth wasn't determined by others' recognition, that dignity came from internal compass rather than external validation. As they walked toward the school exit together, Valentina felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with military honors or public recognition. She'd served her country with distinction, but more importantly, she was raising a daughter who understood that service came in many forms, that respect was earned through character rather than appearance, and that sometimes the strongest response to ignorance was simply continuing to be yourself. The parents who dismissed her would remember this evening for years to come, not because of her uniform or her medals, but because of the grace with which she'd handled their misjudgment. Some would grow from the experience, examining their own biases and becoming more thoughtful community members. Others would simply move on, their worldview barely dented by the collision with a truth they weren't ready to accept. But Valentina had never been concerned with changing everyone's mind. She'd learned long ago that respect was something you gave yourself first, and that the opinions of people who judged others by surface appearances were worth exactly what you paid for them. Tonight had been about community recognition, but tomorrow would be about the work that really mattered, continuing to build bridges between military and civilian families, one conversation, one program, one child at a time. The chocolate cake was still waiting at home, its rainbow sprinkles still catching the light, still promising joy that hadn't been diminished by yesterday's disappointment or tonight's vindication.
Valentina and Sofia would share it together, celebrating not the award or the apologies, but the simple fact that they had each other. They had work that mattered, and they had the strength to face whatever judgments tomorrow might bring. 3 weeks after the ceremony at Riverside Elementary, Valentina received an unexpected visitor at her office on the military base. Dr. Amanda Foster sat in the waiting area, looking significantly less composed than she had during their previous encounters. She'd requested this meeting through official channels, explaining that she wanted to discuss potential collaboration between her pediatric practice and military family support services. Valentina's office reflected her dual identity as both warrior and educator. Military commendations shared wall space with photographs from humanitarian missions, while her desk held both tactical planning manuals and child psychology research papers. A small drawing from Sofia was taped to her computer monitor, showing two stick figures in uniform saluting an American flag, with "My Hero Mommy" written in crayon across the top. Dr. Foster entered with the careful demeanor of someone who'd spent considerable time rehearsing this conversation. "Colonel Martinez, thank you for agreeing to see me. I've been doing a lot of reflection since the ceremony, and I realize I need to understand something better than I currently do." Valentina gestured to the chair across from her desk, noting the genuine discomfort in Dr. Foster's posture. "What specifically would you like to understand, Doctor?" "How military families actually live," Dr. Foster replied directly. "I treat children from military families in my practice, but I realize I've been making assumptions about their needs based on stereotypes rather than reality. When I saw you in uniform at Sofia's party, I immediately categorized you as potentially traumatized, possibly unstable, definitely inappropriate around children. Those assumptions were not only wrong, they were professionally irresponsible." Dr. Foster opened a notebook she'd brought with her, pages filled with careful handwriting. "I've been reviewing the medical histories of my military family patients, and I'm seeing patterns I missed before. Higher rates of anxiety, not because their parents are damaged, but because they're constantly adapting to new communities that don't understand their lifestyle. Social isolation, not because military families are antisocial, but because civilian communities often don't know how to integrate them." Valentina leaned back in her chair, recognizing the intellectual honesty that drove Dr. Foster's inquiry. "Those patterns you're identifying are exactly what my research addresses. Military children face unique challenges, but they're not broken. They're often more resilient, more adaptable, more globally aware than their civilian peers. The problem isn't the children or their families. The problem is communities that treat military service as something foreign rather than something valuable." "That's exactly what I did," Dr. Foster admitted. "I saw your uniform and immediately thought potential PTSD, possible anger issues, children might be at risk. I never considered that your military experience might have given you skills that made you better with children, not worse." Valentina pulled out a thick folder from her desk drawer, filled with research data and case studies. "Dr. Foster, would you be interested in seeing what comprehensive support for military families actually looks like? Not the stereotypical wounded warrior narrative, but programs that recognize military families' strengths while addressing their genuine challenges." Over the next hour, Valentina walked Dr. Foster through research that challenged every assumption the pediatrician had held about military families. Children of deployed parents often scored higher on independence and problem-solving assessments. Military families demonstrated stronger crisis management skills during community emergencies. Children who'd lived on multiple bases showed enhanced cultural competency and language acquisition abilities. "The issue," Valentina explained, "isn't that military families are damaged goods that need fixing. The issue is that civilian communities often isolate military families because they don't understand our culture, our values, or our capabilities. When Sofia starts school in a new district, teachers often assume she'll have behavioral problems because her mom deploys occasionally. They're so focused on looking for trauma symptoms that they miss her advanced organizational skills, her ability to adapt to new social situations, her genuine empathy for other children facing difficulties." Foster took extensive notes, asking detailed questions about diagnostic criteria, intervention strategies, and community integration protocols. Her medical training had taught her to identify pathology, but she was discovering an entire body of research focused on recognizing and building upon military family strengths. Colonel Martinez, Dr. Foster said as their meeting concluded, "I'd like to propose something. What if we developed a training program for civilian healthcare providers who work with military families? Something that helps us recognize the difference between supporting families through genuine challenges and pathologizing experiences we don't understand." Valentina smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Dr. Foster had seen from her. "Doctor, that's exactly the kind of community partnership that makes a real difference. Military families don't need to be rescued from their lifestyle. They need communities that recognize their contributions and support their unique needs." The collaboration that emerged from that conversation became a model for civilian-military community integration. Dr. Foster's medical practice began hosting monthly information sessions where military families could share their experiences with civilian healthcare providers. Valentina developed training modules that helped teachers, coaches, and community leaders understand military family culture without reducing it to stereotypes about trauma and dysfunction. But the most significant change happened in smaller, more personal ways. Jessica Patterson, who'd initially dismissed Valentina's uniform as inappropriate, found herself reconsidering her assumptions about many things. She began volunteering with a local organization that supported military spouses pursuing higher education, drawn by the same energy management skills that had made her successful in business. Her Instagram posts gradually shifted from lifestyle content to highlighting the achievements of military families in her community. Marcus Chen took a different approach to his transformation. His marketing background made him acutely aware of how civilian communities marketed themselves to potential military residents, and he was disturbed by what he discovered. Base housing tours emphasized shopping and entertainment options while ignoring educational quality, community involvement opportunities, or cultural activities. Military families were being sold a consumer experience rather than invited into genuine community membership. He began working with the local Chamber of Commerce to develop more authentic outreach programs. Instead of highlighting restaurants and shopping centers, they showcased community volunteer opportunities, local history projects, and civic engagement options. Military families weren't potential customers to be attracted with amenities. They were potential neighbors with skills, experience, and perspectives that could strengthen the entire community. Rebecca Thornton's organic lifestyle blog evolved into something more substantial as she grappled with her own privilege and assumptions. She began interviewing military spouses about sustainable living practices they developed during deployments, discovering innovative approaches to resource conservation, community gardening, and local food systems. Military families weren't environmental burdens requiring education about green living. They were often environmental innovators who'd learned sustainability through necessity and could teach civilian communities more efficient practices. The changes weren't universal or immediate. Some parents who'd been at Sofia's birthday party remained uncomfortable around Valentina, unable to reconcile their preconceptions with the reality of her achievements. They attended school events where she spoke, applauded politely, and continued believing that her success was exceptional rather than representative of broader military family capabilities. But Sofia noticed the differences in how her classmates' parents interacted with her family. Playdates were offered more frequently, often by parents who expressed genuine curiosity about military life rather than pity for its presumed hardships. When Valentina attended school events in uniform, conversations focused on her work rather than assumptions about her psychological state. Parents asked about her deployments with interest rather than concern, wanting to understand the humanitarian projects she'd coordinated rather than the trauma she'd supposedly endured. Most importantly, Sofia began to see her mother's service as something that enhanced their community rather than something that separated them from it. When other children asked about Valentina's uniform, Sofia explained with pride about the schools her mother had helped build, the medical clinics she'd established, the children she'd helped in places where help was desperately needed. The chocolate cake incident became family legend, but not because of the humiliation Valentina had experienced. It became significant because it marked the moment when their community began to grow beyond its comfortable assumptions. Sofia would later tell the story to her own children, emphasizing not the ignorance of the adults involved, but their willingness to learn and change when confronted with their mistakes. Valentina continued her military service, eventually retiring as a brigadier general after a career that spanned 3 decades and 4 continents.
Her final assignment involved protocols for military family community integration that were implemented nationwide, helping thousands of families avoid the isolation and misunderstanding she'd experienced. But she measured her success differently than her official performance evaluations suggested. Success was Sofia growing up confident in her identity as both a military child and a community member. Success was Dr. Foster becoming a nationally recognized expert in military family healthcare, training other providers to see strength where they'd previously looked for pathology. Success was Marcus Chen using his marketing skills to help military families find genuine community connection rather than just consumer convenience. Success was measured in the conversations that happened when people moved beyond their initial assumptions, when communities recognized that military families brought capabilities rather than just needs, when children like Sofia could be proud of their parents' service without having to defend it against ignorance. The evening news coverage of Valentina's retirement ceremony included interviews with community members whose lives had been changed by their interactions with military families. Dr. Foster spoke about research that had transformed her practice. Jessica Patterson discussed volunteer work that had expanded her understanding of service. Marcus Chen explained marketing campaigns that had helped military families find authentic community connection. But the most meaningful tribute came from Sofia, now a college student studying international relations with plans to work in humanitarian assistance. When asked what she'd learned from growing up as a military child, her answer was simple. I learned that serving others is the highest honor, whether you wear a uniform or not. I learned that communities are stronger when they welcome everyone's contributions. And I learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought in everyday places like birthday parties and school gymnasiums, where people have to choose between fear and understanding. Valentina watched the interview from her living room, still living in the same house where she'd once sat alone after being dismissed from her daughter's party. The chocolate cake was long gone, but the lessons from that evening continued to ripple through their community, creating changes that would outlast any military decoration or official recognition. The evening news coverage of Valentina's retirement ceremony included interviews with community members whose lives had been changed by their interactions with military families. Dr. Foster spoke about research that had transformed her practice. Jessica Patterson discussed volunteer work that had expanded her understanding of service. Marcus Chen explained marketing campaigns that had helped military families find authentic community connection. But the most meaningful tribute came from Sofia, now a college student studying international relations with plans to work in humanitarian assistance. When asked what she'd learned from growing up as a military child, her answer was simple. I learned that serving others is the highest honor, whether you wear a uniform or not. I learned that communities are stronger when they welcome everyone's contributions. And I learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought in everyday places, like birthday parties and school gymnasiums, where people have to choose between fear and understanding. Valentina watched the interview from her living room, still living in the same house where she'd once sat alone after being dismissed from her daughter's party. The chocolate cake was long gone, but the lessons from that evening continued to ripple through their community, creating changes that would outlast any military decoration or official recognition.
Outside her window, children played in the neighborhood park, their laughter carrying across the evening air. Some were military children, some weren't, but all of them were growing up in a community that had learned to see service as strength, diversity as advantage, and difference as opportunity rather than threat. That transformation, more than any medal or commendation, represented the victory that mattered most. 25 years later, Sofia Martinez Chen stood at the podium in the same Riverside Elementary Gymnasium where her mother had once been honored, but now the roles were reversed. Sofia, now Dr. Sofia Martinez Chen, had returned to her childhood community as the newly appointed director of the National Military Family Research Institute, and she was delivering the keynote address at the school's Silver Anniversary Military Family Appreciation event. The gymnasium looked much the same as it had during her childhood, though technology upgrades had replaced the old sound system, and the walls now displayed a permanent exhibit honoring military families who'd served the community over the past quarter century. Valentina's photograph held a prominent position in the display, but it wasn't the formal military portrait that might have been expected. Instead, it showed her kneeling beside a group of children at a community garden project, all of them wearing matching t-shirts that read, "Growing Together, Military and Civilian Families." The audience that evening represented a community transformed. Military families sat alongside civilian families without the invisible barriers that had once separated them. Parents wore various types of uniforms without explanation or apology, some military, some firefighters, some medical scrubs, some work coveralls. The definition of service had expanded to include the understanding that every job that served others deserved recognition and respect. Sophia began her address by sharing a story the audience knew well, but from a perspective they'd never heard before. 25 years ago, my mother attended my 8th birthday party wearing her military uniform because she'd been called to an emergency meeting that morning. Some of the parents at that party decided her uniform made her inappropriate company for children. What they didn't know was that the emergency meeting involved coordinating humanitarian assistance for a natural disaster, and my mother spent that entire day helping organize relief supplies for families who'd lost everything. The silence in the gymnasium was profound, not because the story was shocking, but because it represented a level of understanding that had taken decades to develop. The parents in attendance didn't just tolerate military families anymore, they actively sought to understand the complexities of military service and its impact on children's lives. That birthday party became a turning point, Sophia continued, not because of the humiliation my mother experienced, but because of what happened afterward. Several parents in this community chose to examine their assumptions rather than defend them. They chose curiosity over judgment. They chose to learn rather than to dismiss. And that choice created ripple effects that are still transforming communities across the country. Dr. Amanda Foster, now in her 70s and recently retired from pediatric practice, sat in the front row with tears streaming down her face. The collaboration she'd initiated with Valentina had evolved into a national model for military family healthcare. The training protocols they developed were now taught in medical schools across the country, and Dr. Foster's research on military family resilience had influenced policy at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Beside her sat Marcus Chen, whose marketing career had taken an unexpected turn after his encounter with Valentina. He'd eventually left corporate marketing to establish a nonprofit organization focused on community integration strategies for military families. His work had helped dozens of communities develop more effective approaches to welcoming military families, moving beyond surface-level amenities to create genuine opportunities for civic engagement and social connection. Jessica Patterson was there too, though her life had changed dramatically since those early days of Instagram lifestyle content and boutique fitness management. Her volunteer work with military spouses pursuing higher education had led to a career in educational administration, specifically focused on developing support systems for military-connected students. She now served as the liaison between 3 school districts and nearby military installations, ensuring that military children receive appropriate academic support during family transitions. But the most significant changes weren't visible in individual career trajectories or community programs. They were evident in the conversations happening around the gymnasium that evening, in the easy familiarity between military and civilian families, in the way children moved seamlessly between different groups without consciousness of the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. Sophia's research at the National Military Family Research Institute had documented these changes scientifically. Her longitudinal study of the Riverside community showed measurable improvements in military family retention rates, academic outcomes for military children, and civilian military social integration. But the statistics only captured part of the transformation. The real change was cultural, emotional, relational. When my mother wore her uniform to my birthday party, Sophia explained to the audience, some of you saw a threat to your children's emotional well-being. Tonight, I want to share what I saw. I saw a woman who'd spent her morning coordinating relief efforts for disaster victims, who'd used her lunch break to help a military spouse navigate veteran education benefits, and who'd still made it to my party because she'd promised to be there. I saw someone whose idea of appropriate dress was clothing that represented her commitment to serving others. The audience shifted slightly, not in discomfort, but in recognition. Many of them were parents or grandparents of children who'd grown up alongside Sophia. Children who'd learned from her mother's example that service took many forms and that strength often looked different than popular culture suggested. Rebecca Thornton, whose organic lifestyle blog had evolved into a sustainable living consultancy specializing in military community environmental initiatives, found herself thinking about her own children's perspectives on that long-ago birthday party. Her daughter Emma, now a military spouse herself, had often credited the Riverside community's integration efforts with shaping her understanding of military life as a positive choice rather than a sacrifice to be endured. The research we've conducted over the past 25 years, Sofia continued, demonstrates that communities with strong civilian-military integration don't just benefit military families, they benefit everyone. Military families bring crisis management skills that help communities respond more effectively to emergencies. They bring cultural competency from living in diverse environments around the world. They bring adaptation that helps communities navigate change more successfully. Sofia clicked to her next slide, showing data from multiple communities across the United States. Communities that actively integrate military families show higher rates of civic engagement, more effective emergency response capabilities, stronger educational outcomes for all students, and more robust economic development. Military families aren't burdens that communities must bear, they're assets that communities are privileged to access. The presentation continued with specific examples from the Riverside community. The community garden project that Valentina had initiated now supplies fresh produce to 3 food banks and provided environmental education for over 500 children annually. The emergency response protocols developed by military families had been activated successfully during 2 natural disasters, significantly reducing property damage and ensuring no loss of life. The definition of service had expanded to include the understanding that every job that served others deserved recognition and respect. Sofia began her address by sharing a story the audience knew well, but from a perspective they'd never heard before. 25 years ago, my mother attended my 8th birthday party wearing her military uniform because she'd been called to an emergency meeting that morning. Some of the parents at that party decided her uniform made her inappropriate company for children. What they didn't know was that the emergency meeting involved coordinating humanitarian assistance for a natural disaster, and my mother spent that entire day helping organize relief supplies for families who'd lost everything. The silence in the gymnasium was profound, not because the story was shocking, but because it represented a level of understanding that had taken decades to develop. The parents in attendance didn't just tolerate military families anymore. They actively sought to understand the complexities of military service and its impact on children's lives. That birthday party became a turning point, Sofia continued, not because of the humiliation my mother experienced, but because of what happened afterward. Several parents in this community chose to examine their assumptions rather than defend them. They chose curiosity over judgment. They chose to learn rather than to dismiss. And that choice created ripple effects that are still transforming communities across the country. Dr. Amanda Foster, now in her 70s and recently retired from pediatric practice, sat in the front row with tears streaming down her face. The collaboration she'd initiated with Valentina had evolved into a national model for military family health care. The training protocols they developed were now taught in medical schools across the country, and Dr. Foster's research on military family resilience had influenced policy at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Beside her sat Marcus Chen, whose marketing career had taken an unexpected turn after his encounter with Valentina. He'd eventually left corporate marketing to establish a nonprofit organization focused on community integration strategies for military families. His work had helped dozens of communities develop more effective approaches to welcoming military families, moving beyond surface-level amenities to create genuine opportunities for civic engagement and social connection. Jessica Patterson was there too, though her life had changed dramatically since those early days of Instagram lifestyle content and boutique fitness management. Her volunteer work with military spouses pursuing higher education had led to a career in educational administration, specifically focused on developing support systems for military-connected students. She now served as the liaison between 3 school districts and nearby military installations, ensuring that military children receive appropriate academic support during family transitions. But the most significant changes weren't visible in individual career trajectories or community programs. They were evident in the conversations happening around the gymnasium that evening, in the easy familiarity between military and civilian families, in the way children moved seamlessly between different groups without consciousness of the barriers that had once. The cultural exchange programs initiated by military spouses had brought international languages, customs, and perspectives into local schools and community organizations. But Sofia's most compelling data focused on the children who'd grown up in this transformed community.
Military children in Riverside showed academic achievement rates significantly higher than national averages for military-connected students. They demonstrated stronger leadership skills, higher rates of community volunteer participation, and more successful transitions to higher education. Equally important, civilian children who'd grown up alongside military families showed enhanced global awareness, stronger crisis management skills, and more sophisticated understanding of diversity and inclusion. The birthday party where my mother was asked to leave, Sofia said, could have been the end of our family's connection to this community. Instead, it became the beginning of a transformation that has influenced national policy on military family community integration. The parents who initially dismissed my mother didn't become the villains of this story, they became its heroes by choosing to grow beyond their initial reactions. As Sofia spoke, she noticed Principal Washington in the audience. Now Principal Emeritus, Dorothy Washington had spent her final years in education documenting the Riverside community's transformation and developing replication models for other school districts. Her work had influenced education policy at the state level and had been recognized by the Department of Education as a national best practice for military-connected student support. I want to address something directly, Sofia continued, because I know some of you were present at that birthday party 25 years ago, and I know some of you have carried guilt about your initial reactions to my mother. Please understand this. Growth requires starting points. Change requires recognition of what needs to be different. Your willingness to examine your assumptions and modify your behavior created space for transformation that has benefited thousands of families beyond our own. The applause that followed was sustained and emotional, recognizing not just Sofia's achievements, but the collective journey the community had undertaken. Parents who'd been present at that original birthday party found themselves crying, not from shame, but from gratitude for the opportunity to have learned and grown in ways they'd never anticipated. Sofia's presentation concluded with a video message from Valentina, now Brigadier General Martinez, retired, speaking from her current position as Senior Advisor for Military Family Policy at the Pentagon. Valentina appeared on screen wearing civilian clothes, sitting in a garden that looked remarkably similar to the community garden she'd helped establish in Riverside. 25 years ago, Valentina said in the video, I experienced one of the most painful moments of my parenting journey when I was asked to leave my daughter's birthday party because some parents felt my military uniform made me inappropriate company for children. Tonight, I want to thank those parents because their initial reaction led to conversations that changed not just our community, but communities across the country. Valentina's voice carried the same calm authority it had always possessed, but now it was tempered with wisdom earned through decades of successful advocacy. The work we've done together in Riverside has influenced military family support policies that now serve over 2 million military children nationwide. The research protocols developed here are used by the Department of Defense to evaluate community integration effectiveness. The educational support models created here have been implemented in school districts serving military families in all 50 states. She paused, looking directly into the camera with the expression Sofia remembered from childhood, when her mother would explain complicated concepts with patience and clarity. But the most important outcome of our work together isn't policy or research or national recognition. It's the children who've grown up understanding that service comes in many forms, that communities are stronger when they welcome everyone's contributions, and that initial judgments can be transformed through genuine relationship. The video concluded with Valentina walking through the Pentagon's Military Family Support Center, where photographs from the Riverside community's integration initiatives were displayed as examples of successful civilian-military collaboration. Military families from around the world visited the center to learn from the Riverside model, taking strategies back to their own communities and creating ripple effects that continued to expand nationally and internationally. As the lights came up in the gymnasium, Sofia moved into the final portion of her presentation, addressing the young people in the audience directly. To the military children here tonight, she said, your family's service is not something to be ashamed of or to hide. It's not something that makes you different in ways that should concern you. Your experiences moving between communities, adapting to new situations, and supporting family members through deployments have given you skills that will serve you throughout your lives.
She turned to address the civilian children as well. To the civilian children here tonight, your military classmates aren't broken or damaged or scary. They're often more resilient, more culturally aware, and more adaptable than other children their age. They have perspectives and experiences that can teach you about courage, sacrifice, and service. They're not charity cases requiring your sympathy, they're potential friends offering their strength. Finally, Sofia addressed the parents and community leaders. To the adults who shape our community policies and social norms, military families don't need to be rescued from their lifestyle or protected from their experiences. They need communities that recognize their contributions, support their transitions, and welcome their participation. They don't need special accommodations as much as they need basic respect and genuine inclusion. The formal presentation concluded, but the evening continued with small group discussions that reflected the community's ongoing commitment to learning and growth. Military spouses shared experiences with civilian parents who asked thoughtful questions about deployment cycles, moving logistics, and maintaining family stability during separations. Retired military members discussed their transition to civilian careers with business leaders interested in understanding how military skills translated to civilian work environments. Military children and civilian children planned joint community service projects that would leverage their combined skills and perspectives. Dr. Foster found herself in conversation with several young parents whose children were just beginning their educational journeys. "When I first encountered Colonel Martinez," she admitted, "I made every mistake it was possible to make. I saw her uniform and immediately assumed pathology rather than strength. I treated her military experience as a liability rather than an asset. The medical training that taught me to identify problems prevented me from recognizing capabilities." One of the young mothers, whose husband was deployed overseas, nodded thoughtfully. "It's interesting that you mention that, because when we moved here, I was prepared for people to treat us differently because of my husband's service. But our experience has been completely different. Our neighbors ask how they can support us during deployment, but they also ask what skills we bring to community projects. They see military service as something that enhances our family rather than something that damages it." Marcus Chen joined their conversation, bringing with him the insights he'd gained from 2 decades of working with military families in transition. The shift in community perception didn't happen overnight, he explained. It required sustained effort from both military and civilian families. Military families had to be willing to share their experiences and perspectives rather than just trying to blend in. Civilian families had to be willing to examine their assumptions and ask questions rather than making judgments. The conversation expanded to include other parents whose children had grown up in the transformed Riverside community. Their stories revealed the long-term impact of the changes that had begun with a single birthday party incident. Children who'd attended elementary school together had maintained friendships through high school and college, despite multiple military family relocations. Civilian children had chosen military service after learning about its opportunities from military classmates. Military children had pursued civilian careers with confidence gained from successful integration experiences. Jessica Patterson shared her own family's evolution with characteristic honesty. "My children grew up watching me learn from my mistakes with Colonel Martinez," she said. "They saw me acknowledge that I'd been wrong, work to understand different perspectives, and change my behavior based on what I learned. I think that experience taught them more about personal growth and community responsibility than any lecture I could have given them." Her daughter Sarah, now a social worker specializing in veteran family services, had driven in from the state capitol to attend the evening's event. "Growing up, I watched my mom transform from someone who was quick to judge people based on surface appearances to someone who actively sought to understand experiences different from her own. That transformation influenced my career choice and my approach to working with families who might seem different or challenging at first glance." As the evening progressed, Sofia found herself in conversation with community members who'd joined the Riverside area long after the initial birthday party incident, but who'd benefited from the cultural changes it had precipitated. Military families moving to Riverside now experienced immediate integration support, with welcome packets that included information about community volunteer opportunities, civic engagement options, and social connection resources. Civilian families new to the area received orientation sessions that included information about military family experiences and ways to support military neighbors during deployments and transitions. What strikes me most about the Riverside model, said Dr. Patricia Williams, the former military recruiter who'd first encouraged Valentina to pursue military service and who now served as a consultant on military family community integration, is that it doesn't treat military and civilian families as separate populations, requiring different approaches. It treats them as community members with different experiences and skills who can strengthen each other when they're brought together effectively. Dr. Williams had traveled from Washington, D.C. to attend the anniversary event, bringing with her data from dozens of communities that had implemented variations of the Riverside integration model. Military families moving to communities that use these approaches report higher satisfaction rates, longer residence periods, and stronger community connections. Equally important, civilian communities using these approaches report higher military family retention rates, which brings economic and social benefits that extend far beyond military population support. The evening's final activity was a community commitment ceremony, where civilian and military families made joint pledges to continue the integration work that had transformed Riverside. Children and adults signed banners that would be displayed in the school, the community center, and the local library, serving as visible reminders of the community's commitment to inclusion and mutual support. Sofia stood with her mother's former colleagues, her childhood friends, and community members who'd become extended family through shared commitment to growth and understanding. The gymnasium that had once been the site of her mother's recognition ceremony now felt like the heart of a community that had learned to see diversity as strength, service as honor, and growth as an ongoing process rather than a destination. As families began to leave the gymnasium, children carrying balloons and adults carrying program materials and new contact information, Sofia reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Her mother's experience at a children's birthday party had catalyzed changes that influenced national policy, but the real victory was visible in the easy interactions between military and civilian families, in the children who moved seamlessly between different groups, in the adults who asked questions from curiosity rather than judgment. The chocolate cake from Sofia's 8th birthday party had been consumed and forgotten within hours of that long-ago event, but the lessons learned from her mother's treatment at that party had continued to nourish community growth for 25 years, creating space for understanding that transcended the original incident and established foundations for continued learning and development. Walking out of the gymnasium with community members who'd become genuine friends, Sofia understood that her mother's legacy wasn't measured in military decorations or policy achievements. It was measured in communities that had learned to welcome service members as contributors rather than just recipients, in children who understood that strength came in many forms, and in adults who discovered that their initial assumptions about others often revealed more about their own limitations than about the people they were judging. The birthday party that had begun with embarrassment and dismissal had evolved into an annual community celebration that brought military and civilian families together in recognition of shared values and mutual support. Military children no longer needed to hide or apologize for their parents' service. Civilian children had learned to appreciate the unique perspectives and skills their military classmates brought to their community. Adults had discovered that integration required effort from everyone but benefited everyone as well. As Sofia drove home that evening, she passed the community garden that had grown from her mother's initial integration efforts. Even in the darkness, she could see the outline of raised beds where military and civilian families worked together to grow food for local food banks, to teach children about environmental stewardship, and to create spaces where natural conversations led to lasting friendships. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her mother. "Watched the live stream of your presentation. Proud of you, proud of our community, grateful for the journey we've all taken together. The uniform that once made me unwelcome in our community now represents the service that brought us all together. Thank you for carrying this work forward." Sofia smiled, thinking about the children who would grow up in communities shaped by the understanding that service deserved respect, that diversity strengthened social bonds, and that communities grew stronger when they welcomed everyone's contributions. The birthday party incident had ended with a child's disappointment and a mother's humiliation, but it had begun a transformation that would continue to influence families for generations to come, creating communities where no child would ever need to feel ashamed of their parents' service to others. The military families and civilian families of Riverside had learned that integration wasn't about military families becoming more civilian or civilian families becoming more military. It was about everyone becoming more human, more understanding, more committed to the recognition that service to others, in whatever form it took, deserved celebration rather than suspicion, support rather than judgment, and gratitude rather than judgment. In communities across the country, birthday parties now include children whose parents wore different types of uniforms, whose families had different experiences, whose perspectives enriched rather than threatened the celebration. And in gymnasium presentations, research conferences, and policy meetings, the Riverside model continued to demonstrate that the most profound social changes often began with individual choices to grow beyond initial assumptions and create space for understanding that transformed entire communities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.